I watched them frame the first house on my land like it was nothing like my family's fence line was just a suggestion. By the time the number hit 57 people in town were calling it progress, and I was the stubborn rancher standing in the way. What nobody knew was I let them finish because the real power on my property wasn't a fence. It was an 80-year-old federal dam. My name's Jack Bennett, and my family's been on this stretch outside Pine Ridge, Colorado, long before anyone thought a community lifestyle brand needed a homeowners association. After my parents passed, it was just me, my sister Megan, and paperwork that smelled like dust and grief. Next door, a developer rolled in with glossy banners and a name that sounded expensive, Sunset Meadows. And like every shiny new subdivision, it came with a HOA and a president who treated the title like a crown. Her name was Vivian Cross. Perfect blowout, perfect teeth, perfect little clipboard held tight to her chest like it was a badge. She drove a white Tesla, wore power suits to casual meetings, and spoke in that soft, careful voice people use right before they try to take something from you. The first time she came to my porch, she smiled like we were old friends. Mr. Bennett. Jack, this community needs clarity. We can't have confusion about property lines. She said confusion the way a cop says weapon. 2 days later, I got certified mail boundary dispute resolution in bold like it was a favor. Inside was a map with bright red lines that somehow drifted right into my pasture. I called the county. They shrugged in a polite voice and told me to follow the process. I showed up at a meeting with my deed and the old survey. Vivian showed up with a lawyer, a projector, and an audience. She clicked through slides about environmental safety and responsible development, then looked at me like I was a stain on the carpet. We have families moving in, she said. We can't let one landowner endanger the future. And then, like clockwork, survey stakes appeared. New stakes, fresh paint, planted in soil my grandfather used to walk every morning with a coffee mug and a limp from '79. I pulled one up and stared at it like it was evidence because that's what it was. A fake boundary on a real piece of ground. The next morning, the machines arrived. Not one little truck, not a couple guys checking. Heavy equipment, a dozer, a grader. The sound of steel biting into earth before sunrise while I stood at the edge of my own field and watched them carve a road where my fence line used to be. Vivian didn't hide it either. She stood there in sunglasses watching my grass roll up like carpet. "Oh, good," she said when she saw me. "You're here. We'll need access across your portion temporarily." My portion. That's when I understood what this really was: local corruption dressed up like community planning. I tried everything the normal way first. I called my attorney. I filed complaints. I showed up at the courthouse with receipts, photos, the original property description, the whole boring stack of truth. And every time I thought the system would correct itself, Vivian slid around it. A family safety Facebook group popped up overnight, full of people I'd never seen posting like they were reading from the same script. Concerned parents claiming my ranch was contaminating water. Somebody posted that I'd threatened to unleash cattle stampedes on residents. I have 63 head of cattle. Half of them would panic if a squirrel blinked too loudly. But that didn't matter. Panic doesn't need facts. It needs volume. Then came the news. Channel 7 footage of officials in hazmat suits near the creek acting like they'd discovered the next plague. A county supervisor talking into cameras about credible reports. A lab report flashed on screen, numbers circled in red, nobody explaining what they actually meant. Vivian held a press conference under a banner that literally said, "Protecting our children's future." She dabbed at dry eyes with a tissue like she'd been practicing in the mirror. "How many children have been harmed?" she asked, staring straight into the lens. "How long has this man been allowed to endanger families?" I stood in my kitchen watching it, jaw tight, hands shaking, not from guilt, from rage. Because it worked. Rusty's Diner stopped buying my beef. The hardware store got quiet when I walked in. People I'd known my whole life suddenly looked past me like I was a problem they didn't want to catch. And then the real hammer dropped. An emergency court session. 17 minutes. That's how long it took for a Judge Caldwell to read prepared text like she was watching a hostage video. The court finds immediate necessity. And just like that, I was facing seizure proceedings, timelines, impossible deadlines, all wrapped in pretty words like public good. I went back to my porch that night and watched the construction lights sparkle across stolen ground. Do you know what it feels like to see strangers building a neighborhood on the land that paid for your grandparents' funeral? It's not poetic. It's not cinematic. It's just this cold pressure in your chest that doesn't let you breathe right. I'll be honest, there was a moment I almost folded. Not because I suddenly believed Vivian, not because I thought I deserved it, but because the math was brutal. The legal fees, the clock, the public smear, the way every next step seemed designed to drain you until you give up and sign whatever they put in front of you. I caught myself staring at a contract on my table thinking, maybe I sell the corner and keep the rest. Maybe I stop bleeding money. Maybe I just survive. And then Megan called. Her voice was sharp, excited the way it gets when she finds something that changes the whole board. "Jack," she said, "remember Dad's safety deposit box? The one we could never locate after the funeral. I had forgotten it even existed. Dad was old-school suspicious of banks, except for the one box he kept for papers too important to sit in a closet." Megan found the key taped inside his desk drawer like some paranoid little punchline. She met me at First National where the air smelled like floor wax and other people's anxiety. The box itself was boring, just a metal rectangle. What came out of it wasn't. A federal flood control agreement signed in Washington, D.C., March 15, 1943. Army Corps of Engineers Operational Manual, 47 pages. Correspondence establishing permanent federal water management authority that didn't care about county politics, developer schedules, or Vivian Cross's Botox appointments. The treasure was buried in the technical section. Mandatory seasonal water releases during peak snowmelt. Late May. Non-negotiable, federally required regardless of local development. Written by engineers who understood something Vivian didn't. Water doesn't negotiate. I called a family friend that night, Tommy McGrath. Former engineer, former military, the kind of guy who reads government documents like they're scripture. He spread the papers across my kitchen table, adjusted his reading glasses, and let out this low whistle. "Sweet Jesus on a motorcycle," he said. "You're telling me these clowns built 57 houses in a federal flood control zone without notifying FEMA?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," I said. Tommy flipped to the maps, traced the natural channels carved into the land like scars. "If you release water per the manual," he said, tapping the topo lines, "it follows these paths, straight through Sunset Meadows, 8 feet in the construction zone tops, drains in under a week. Property loss, but temporary." I stared at him, feeling something shift inside me, like I'd been underwater for months and just found air. Vivian had been so focused on stealing my land through local pressure that she'd ignored federal authority older than color television. Every house she built was sitting in violation of regulations that could trigger condemnation so fast it would make her head spin. Memorial Day weekend was 3 weeks away. The manual listed exact dates, May 23rd through May 25th, when releases had to happen at specific levels. And Vivian, in her endless talent for arrogance, had scheduled Sunset Meadows' grand opening that same weekend. The next days were quiet on the surface, but behind the scenes, it was war, just not the kind Vivian understood. Tommy and I inspected the dam controls, tested manual releases, logged everything like we were preparing for an audit because we were. I notified the right authorities. I documented the water levels. I played it clean by the book because if you're going to swing a hammer this big, you don't do it sloppy. Meanwhile, Megan fed documents to an investigative reporter named Rebecca Morrison. Floodplain violations, questionable insurance clauses, the whole beautiful mess. The kind of story that makes agencies wake up and start asking uncomfortable questions. By the time May 22nd hit, the final piece locked into place. Rebecca found the insurance angle policies sold with the homes that excluded acts of nature and federal water management activity. Flood insurance that didn't cover floods if the flood came from routine dam operations. That's not a mistake, that's a scheme. The night before the release, I stood beside the dam with Tommy, listening to the reservoir press against concrete like a held breath. The air was cold pine heavy, and my stomach felt like it was full of nails. Tommy looked at me once serious. "You ready?" "I'm ready," I said, and I meant it. At 5:47 a.m., I started the release exactly as mandated. Not revenge, compliance. The first sound wasn't dramatic. It was mechanical metal shifting water, beginning to move, the deep rumble that tells you something big is happening, whether you're emotionally prepared or not. Then the creek swelled, not a cute little rise, a surge. It pushed through the channels like it had been waiting all year to do what it always does. It spilled over the new roads, wrapped around foundations, climbed porch steps of houses that still smelled like fresh lumber and marketing brochures. By the time the sun fully cleared the ridge, Sunset Meadows looked like someone had dropped it into a bathtub. And then Vivian arrived. She came flying in like a scene from a bad movie, white Tesla skidding to a stop, heels sinking into mud, screaming at workers and residents, like volume could change hydrology. "This is sabotage," she shouted, jabbing a finger in my direction when she spotted me near the access gate. "He did this. Arrest him. He's destroying our community." I didn't yell back. I didn't need to. A pair of federal investigators stepped out of a black SUV behind her, calm, as if they were arriving at a routine appointment. One of them held a folder. The other held a badge, low and quiet. "Ma'am," the lead investigator said, "who authorized construction in a federally regulated flood control zone without required notification?" Vivian's mouth opened, and nothing came out. For the first time since I'd met her, she didn't have a script. That afternoon, the story stopped being rancher versus community and became what it always should have been: fraud, corruption, and illegal development. At the emergency meeting that night, I laid the 1943 manual on the table. I pointed to the seasonal release requirements, the dates, the authority. I watched Vivian try to pivot into victim mode until the investigator read charges that didn't care about her tears. When they took her out, she wasn't shouting anymore. She was just pale, stunned, finally understanding that there are rules bigger than a clipboard and a HOA title. I didn't celebrate. I didn't high-five anybody. I just stood there while the room went silent, feeling the weight lift, because the land didn't need a hero. It just needed the truth to land in the right hands. Lesson: when a bully hides behind local power, bring receipts from a higher authority.